The sensor clicked against my wrist before anyone said hello. I had barely stepped off the transit pod onto Vethker Station when one of the station attendants, a thin gray-skinned Kalian with 4 arms and no expression, pressed a small device against my pulse point and read the number on its screen. He said nothing. He just noted it on a pad and stepped aside to let me pass. I looked back at him as I walked through the gate. He was already writing something. Whatever he had written, it did not look like a welcome. My name is Marin Voss. I am a combat specialist with 14 years of service, 2 operational tours, 1 desk job I hated, and 1 very strange assignment that had brought me to the far edge of Alliance space with a single duffel bag and orders I had read 11 times on the journey because I still could not fully believe them. The orders said, in the plain and bloodless language of military bureaucracy, that I was to report to the Galactic Combined Arms Academy on Vethkor Station for evaluation by the Joint Instructor Panel, and that upon successful completion of said evaluation, I would be considered for a posting as the first human combat instructor in the Academy's 400-year history. Upon successful completion. That phrase had done a lot of work during the 11 readings. The station was large in the way that only things built by multiple species over several generations can be large, not designed so much as accumulated, with corridors that widened and narrowed without logic, ceilings that soared in some sections and pressed down in others, lighting that shifted from blue-white to deep amber as you moved from one species' residential block to another. I passed a group of Makari cadets in the main concourse. Each one of them stood roughly 2.5 meters tall and was built like something that had been quarried rather than born. They looked at me the way you might look at a pigeon that had wandered into a cathedral. Not hostile, just genuinely puzzled by the scale difference. I kept walking. Colonel Nadia Bright, my commanding officer back on Earth, had given me exactly 1 piece of advice before I boarded the transit. She had looked me in the eye across her desk in the way that people look at you when they want you to understand that they are being serious, and she had said, "Do not embarrass us." Then she had paused, reconsidered, and added, "And come back." I had told her I would do my best on both counts. She had not looked entirely reassured. The Academy's administrative block was in the station's inner ring, past a long corridor, lined with plaques commemorating graduates who had gone on to distinguish themselves in various Alliance operations. I read the names as I walked. Vorthari, Queth, Thashan, Mekari, Kaelian. Every species in the Alliance represented in bronze and stone, their service records reduced to a few engraved lines. No human names, not yet. The corridor was not an intimidation tactic. It was simply a fact displayed without editorial comment. I found that more honest than a speech would have been. The administrator who checked me in was a Thaishan, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from having seen enough of the world that almost nothing surprises you anymore. She handed me a room assignment, a schedule, and a data chip. The data chip contained, she explained, the biosensor protocols for my evaluation. I would be fitted with a full biometric harness each morning, and it would remain on my person for the duration of each day's assessment. Heart rate, cortisol levels, neural stress markers, reflex response time. Everything that could be measured would be measured. The panel reviews all data in aggregate, she said. You will not see the readings in real time. I said that was fine. She looked at me for a moment. Most candidates ask to see their own data, she said. I told her I already knew what my data looked like. She made a small note on her pad and sent me on my way. My quarters were in a human-compatible wing that had been prepared specifically for my visit, which meant the gravity was correct, the temperature was correct, and there was a small window that looked out onto the station's outer hull and, beyond it, the deep and permanent dark of space. I sat on the edge of the bunk and looked out at it for a while. The stars out here were different. Not different in any measurable way. Stars are stars, hydrogen burning at distance. But the configuration was unfamiliar, and there is something about an unfamiliar sky that reminds you exactly how far from home you are. I did not mind being far from home. I had been far from home before, but this was a different kind of far. The kind measured not in kilometers, but in the fact that I was the only human on the station, which held approximately 4,000 people, and that every single one of them had, in some small or large way, already formed an opinion about whether I belonged here. The data chip also contained the names and profiles of the 5 instructors who would conduct my evaluation. I read them before I slept. Instructor Drethar of the Vorthari, 6-limbed, cold-blooded, a specialist in ambush mechanics and reactive speed. His record listed 32 years of active tactical instruction and, before that, a combat career that took up 2 full pages in a font size I had to enlarge to read. His photograph showed a being that looked like something designed by an engineer who had been told to make a predator and had decided not to compromise on any of the details. Instructor Isolon of the Kaelian, one of the rare Kaelian individuals who operated with partial independence from the Hive Cognition Network, which, the profile explained, made her better at evaluating non-Kaelian subjects because she could model individual psychology rather than collective response. She had written 3 academic papers on cross-species stress physiology. The titles were long and the abstracts were longer. I read the first one. It was about me, in the sense that it was about humans, about the anomalous nature of human fear chemical profiles, which she had apparently been studying from a distance for years, using second-hand data. I found that interesting. Instructor Vor Callis of the Macari. His photograph needed no caption. He was what Macari looked like at maximum development, which is to say that he appeared to be made of something denser than ordinary matter. His profile listed a specialty in endurance conditioning and physical resilience. His personal record included surviving 3 events that the Academy had classified, with admirable restraint, as structurally compromising engagements. I read that phrase twice. Instructor Shenata of the Queth. The profile explained that Shenata did not communicate in standard Alliance speech, but had been fitted with a translation interface for the purposes of the evaluation. The Queth were a telepathic species, and Shenata's specialty was psychological assessment under duress, reading the chemical, neurological signatures of fear, deciding what they revealed about a candidate's true capacity. The photograph showed a being that was smaller than I expected, pale gray, with very large eyes that in the image seemed to be looking at something slightly to the left of the camera. I had the feeling, reading the profile, that Shenata had already formed a preliminary opinion about me before we had met, based on whatever data had preceded my arrival. Instructor Laurel Dev of the Thaishan, the oldest of the 5. Her file was the shortest, which I had come to understand, in military contexts, usually meant the longest actual record. Warrior, philosopher, 41 years of instruction. Before that, a tactical career that was summarized in 3 sentences, and footnoted with a reference to a separate classified file that I did not have clearance to read. Her specialty was listed as strategic integration, the capacity to synthesize training into coherent decision-making under live conditions. She had passed or failed more evaluation candidates than any other active instructor in the academy. Her pass rate was 41%. I put the data chip down and looked back out the window. I thought about what Colonel Bright had said. I thought about the plaques in the corridor with no human names on them. I thought about the station attendant who had read my pulse before he said hello, and the number he had written on his pad, and what he had made of it. Then I checked my own pulse with 2 fingers on my wrist, the way my father had taught me when I was a child, and convinced that everything was harder than it needed to be. And he had said that the first thing you do when everything feels large is find out what your body is actually doing, because your body usually knows something your head hasn't caught up to yet. 62 beats per minute. I lay down on the bunk, and I slept without any difficulty, which was something I had always been able to do, and which, in the days that followed, would turn out to matter a great deal more than I expected. The morning began with Drethar. He was waiting in the assessment corridor when I arrived, standing completely still in the way that cold-blooded predator species stand still. Not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of readiness, the kind of motionlessness that is a step away from very fast movement. All 6 of his limbs were folded with a precision that seemed deliberate. His scales were a deep brown black that caught the corridor light in thin lines along the ridges. He was large, not Macari large, but the kind of large that carries threat in a different way. Not mass but speed, not weight but angle. He looked at my biosensor harness when I walked in. Then he looked at my face. Then he looked at the harness again, as if verifying that the numbers he was about to see would indeed come from the small and relatively fragile being standing in front of him. Specialist Voss, he said. His voice came through a translation collar in a flat, even tone that matched the expression on his face, which was also flat and even. Instructor Drethar, I said. He gestured toward the assessment room without further introduction. The room was built for the test he had designed. It was a long, narrow corridor approximately 30 meters from end to end, with panels on the walls, floor, and ceiling that could each independently produce a stimulus. A flash of light, a burst of sound, a pressure pulse, a sudden movement. The test, his assistant explained, measured reaction time to unpredictable, multi-directional stimuli, while the subject moved through the corridor at a standard walking pace. The subject was to respond to each stimulus by pressing a sensor pad on their wrist before the stimulus ended. Response time was measured in hundredths of a second. The Vorthari cadet record, set by one of Drethar's own students, was a mean response time of 0.08 seconds. The average across all species was somewhere between 0.1 and 0.19 seconds. I walked the quarter twice as a calibration run. The stimuli came from everywhere and from angles I did not expect. I missed 2 in the first run and 1 in the second. My mean response time over both runs settled at 0.23 seconds. Drethar reviewed the numbers on his screen. He did not say anything dismissive. He did not say anything at all for a moment, which I had already come to understand was his version of commentary. Then he made a note and moved to the second component of the assessment, which was a series of reaction tasks in close quarters, responding to physical movement from a training drone, blocking, redirecting, repositioning. The drone was calibrated for Vorthari reaction benchmarks, which meant it moved at speeds I was not always able to track cleanly. I managed well enough, not brilliantly, well enough. At the end of the session, Drethar stood across from me with his arms folded in that precise way and looked at the biosensor summary his assistant handed him. My readings had been exactly what a human under moderate physical and perceptual stress would produce. Elevated heart rate, standard cortisol response, normal reflex activation profile, all exactly where the xenophysiology textbook said they would be. He looked at the numbers, he looked at me. Something moved in his expression very briefly, that I could not read precisely, but which felt like the beginning of a conclusion. Then he handed the summary back to his assistant and told me I was dismissed for the day. I thanked him and left. I thought, walking back to my quarters, about what he had seen in those numbers. He had seen a human performing at expected human levels, which was to say, below every metric his own students achieved routinely. He had seen nothing surprising. And I thought about how the most dangerous thing in any assessment is when the assessor decides they already know what they are looking at. I had let him reach that conclusion deliberately, not by performing badly on purpose, but simply by performing honestly, by being exactly what I appeared to be, by giving him for now the data he expected. The day after Drithar, I met Isolon. She was smaller than I expected from the photograph, not physically. Her dimensions were exactly as the file had described, but in the quality of her presence. Where Drethar had filled a room with stillness, Isolon filled a room with attention. She was watching me from the moment I stepped through the door, and she was watching me the way someone watches a problem they have been thinking about for a long time finally appear in a form they can directly examine. Her assessment room was different. There were no corridors, no drones, no physical challenges. There was a single chair in the center and various sensor arrays positioned around it on articulated arms. And the air had a faint chemical quality that I recognized from the briefing notes as an olfactory analysis environment. She could read chemical markers in the air. She was effectively going to smell what I felt. I sat in the chair. The test, her assistant explained, would involve a series of controlled stress inductions. Nothing physically harmful, but increasingly uncomfortable. Pressure, temperature variation, loud and disorienting sound sequences, and at higher levels mild electrical stimulus applied to the surface of the skin. At each stage, I could end the session by pressing a pad on the armrest. My pain threshold and stress chemical output would be tracked and compared against the cross-species database. The first stages were genuinely unremarkable. Noise, cold, a feeling of pressure across the chest, standard. I sat through them without pressing the pad, not because I was trying to perform endurance, but because none of it was the kind of thing that required stopping. At stage 4, the electrical stimulus came. It was not pleasant. It was, by the clinical definition used in the test, painful. I recognized the sensation, noted it, breathed through it, and did not press the pad. Isolon's sensor arrays were, I assume, showing her exactly what the textbooks predicted. Fear chemicals at normal human output, stress markers at expected levels, pain threshold reading as average to slightly above average for a human subject with a military conditioning. History, all normal, all predicted, but I heard her at stage 5 recalibrate one of the sensors. I heard it because I was listening for something like that, not because I had any way of knowing she would do it. I heard it because I had spent 14 years learning to hear things in the middle of other things. The small sound of an instrument being adjusted because the reading does not match what you expected. I did not react to the sound. I kept my breathing even, and my expression neutral, and I kept my eyes on the middle distance the way my first trainer had taught me when I was 19 years old and being put through something that felt very large. At the end of the session, after I pressed the pad at stage 7, not because I was at my limit, but because going further would have registered as performance rather than data, Isolon did something none of her colleagues had done. She came and stood in front of me, quite close, and she looked at my face for a long time. Then she said, through her translation interface, "When you said something funny during stage 3, what did you intend by it?" I had made a small comment, almost to myself, about the temperature of the room. Something minor. I had not expected her to flag it. I told her it was a habit. When things were uncomfortable, I made small jokes about them. It helped me stay present. She was quiet for a moment. "Our models predicted that humor production would decline under physical stress," she said, "not increase." I told her that for humans, humor was sometimes a stress response, that it was a way of saying to the situation, "I see you, but you do not own me." She made a note. She did not look entirely satisfied with the note, in the way that someone is not satisfied when the data they have recorded is accurate, but the framework they need to file it under does not yet exist. I went back to my quarters. I sat by the window. The stars outside were the same as they always were, permanent, indifferent, burning. I thought about Isolon recalibrating her sensor. I thought about what she had been expecting and what she had found instead. The two things were close enough that she could tell herself they matched. But they did not quite match, and she knew it, and she had made a note about a joke. The third day was Vorkalis. He was exactly what his photograph had suggested. There is a word. I had to look it up in an exoanthropology text once, for the specific quality of being so physically developed within the parameters of your species that you seem to represent the outer boundary of what that species can structurally achieve. Vorkalis had that quality. He was not aggressive about it. He was simply present in a way that made the room feel smaller and the air feel denser. And when he looked at me, his expression was, I was fairly certain, one of genuine and uninsulting puzzlement. He was wondering, I thought, how something my size intended to be useful in a serious engagement. He was not unkind about the wondering. He just could not quite see the path from here to there. His assessment was physical. Lifting benchmarks, carrying benchmarks, endurance run, impact resistance test using a padded assessment rig. I failed the lifting benchmarks. I met the carrying benchmark at the lower range. I ran the endurance circuit at a pace that was, for a human, very good, and for the species whose record was posted on the wall of the assessment room, not particularly notable. I absorbed the impacts from the rig at a level that Vorkalis's assistant noted without comment was within expected human parameters. At the end, Vorkalis stood across the room and looked at the summary. Then he looked at me. Then, very slowly, he nodded. Not the polite nod of acknowledgement, the nod of someone making a mental note they have not yet figured out how to categorize. I nodded back. He dismissed me without saying anything further. The fourth day was Shenata. The room was dim, not dark, but reduced, the kind of lighting that makes you think about where all the edges of things are. Shenata was seated when I entered. Those large pale eyes in the low light turned slightly to the side in the same way as in the photograph, as if listening to something in a frequency just outside my range. The assessment was psychological induction, no physical stimulus. Images, sound sequences, narrative scenarios delivered through a headset, each designed to activate specific emotional responses. Fear, grief, anger, confusion, the particular vertigo of being in a situation with no clear right choice. The sensors around the chair read my neurochemistry at each stage. The first sequences were straightforward. Fear responses, clearly labeled by my own body's chemistry, rising and settling as each scenario completed. Standard human profile. I did not try to suppress them. Suppression would have read as performance, and performance was not the point. I let the readings be true. But somewhere in the fourth sequence, a scenario involving a choice between two outcomes, neither of them good, with a countdown and no additional information, I felt something shift inside me. Not the fear going away. The fear becoming less loud than the focus. The calculation taking precedence. The part of me that had been trained over years to find the clearest available path even when all paths were difficult, moving to the front. Shenata did not speak during the session. At the end, the translation interface produced a single sentence. Your fear chemical output pattern has a structure I have not previously observed in any non-Queth subject. I asked what the structure was. There was a pause. It does not suppress, the interface said. It transforms. I thought about that. I said that I thought that was probably a fair description. Shenata looked at me for a long time with those very large eyes. Then the session ended. The fifth day was Laurel Dev. Her room had a table with 2 chairs and a holographic display showing a tactical simulation. She was already seated when I arrived, and she gestured to the other chair without looking up from the simulation. I sat. We spent 3 hours working through strategic problems. She presented scenarios and asked for my analysis. I gave it. She refined the scenarios and asked again. She did not tell me when I was right or wrong. She simply moved to the next scenario, which I came to understand was how she evaluated not just conclusions but reasoning. Not just answers but the quality of thought that arrived at them. I was not brilliant. I was not the best strategic thinker who had ever sat in that chair. I knew that with certainty, because some of what she showed me was far beyond my training, and I made mistakes I recognized as mistakes even as I made them. But I reasoned clearly. I changed my position when she introduced new information. I asked questions when I did not know something, rather than guessing loudly. At the end, she shut down the holographic display and looked at me directly for the first time in 3 hours. "Do you know what you are?" she asked. The question was simple. The way she asked it was not. There was weight in it, the weight of someone who had been thinking about the question for some time and was genuinely curious what answer I would give. I looked at her. I thought about the question carefully because it deserved that. Then I said no parts of it. I learn more in rooms like this one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly and made a note on her pad. She dismissed me. I walked back through the corridor with the plaques. I read the names again. Still no human names. The corridor was still simply a fact, displayed without comment. But I looked at it differently now, 5 days in. 5 sets of eyes having taken their measurements and filed their notes. I looked at the blank space at the end of the corridor where future plaques would go, and I thought about the 5 instructors in their rooms with their data and their frameworks, running their models, and finding, each of them in their own way, that the numbers were close to what they expected, but not quite, and that the difference between close to expected and exactly expected was the only question that had ever mattered in this building. The final evaluation was scheduled for 3 days later. I spent those 3 days the way I always spent time before something important. I slept well, I ate well, I ran in the mornings along the station's outer ring exercise track, and I did not think about the test more than was useful. On the second of those 3 days, Isolon sent me a message through the station's internal system. It was short. It said that she had completed her preliminary analysis of my assessment data and had a question she wanted to ask in person if I was willing. I replied that I was. We met in a small common room near the research block. She sat across from me with her translation interface and her 4 folded hands and those very precise, very attentive eyes. "I have been studying human physiology," she said, "for 11 years. From secondary data, reports, field observations, medical literature." She paused. "You are the first human I have assessed directly." I told her I was honored. She made a small gesture that I had come to understand was the Kalian equivalent of a polite deflection. "I want to ask you about something specific," she said. "In my analysis of stress response data across species, there is a consistent pattern. As physical threat increases, the autonomic stress response increases proportionally. Heart rate, cortisol output, neural activation. The curve goes up. For every species we have assessed, the curve goes up." She paused. "In your data," she said, "the curve goes up to a point, and then in certain subjects under certain conditions it begins to come down." I waited. "Not because the threat decreases," she said. "The threat is still present. The threat in the scenarios I am describing is at its highest point. But the stress response inverts." She looked at me carefully. "I wanted to ask," she said, "whether you knew this about yourself." I thought about the question. I thought about my father's 2 fingers on my wrist. I thought about a moment in my second operational tour, in a room where everything had gone wrong and there had been no good options, and the only available thing was complete clarity about which of the bad options was least bad, and how I had felt in that moment, not more frightened but less, not because there was less to fear, but because the fear had been converted into something that had an actual use. I told her yes. I said I had known it for a long time. I said that in my experience it was not universal among humans. Not everyone had it, and it could not be fully trained, though training helped. I said that the ones who had it sometimes did not know how to describe it, because it felt less like courage and more like a gear changing, a shift into something quieter and more functional. She was very still while I spoke. When I finished, she said, "I will be watching your biometric data closely during the final assessment." I told her I expected nothing less. She stood to leave. Then she stopped and turned back. "One more question," she said. "When the gear changes, as you describe it, is it something you choose, or something that happens to you?" I thought about it, genuinely, because the answer was not simple. "Both," I said. "First it happens to you. Eventually you learn to meet it halfway." She made a note. She left. I went back to my room and sat by the window. 3 days had passed. In one more day, I would walk into the arena, and the 5 instructors would put on their monitors and watch my numbers, and everything I had built across those 5 days of measurement. and quiet and patience and small jokes and honest failure would either mean something or it would not. My pulse at that moment, if anyone had been measuring it, 63 beats per minute. I found that, as I always did, quietly reassuring. The arena was a large circular space in the Academy's lower operational block. Its walls were smooth composite, its floor was impact-absorbing surface that gave slightly underfoot, and its ceiling was high enough that the space felt more like an outdoor environment than an enclosed room. There were no decorations, no markings, no features that were not purely functional. It was a room designed to find out what you were made of, and it had been designed that way for 400 years, and it did not need to be anything other than what it was. The 5 instructors were in the observation booth above and behind the transparent wall, at the arena's north end. From where I stood at the center of the floor, I could see the shape of them through the glass. 5 distinct silhouettes, each different in proportion and posture, each with a monitoring station and a screen full of real-time biometric data that was feeding from the harness onto my body as I stood there. I had been told the parameters of the final assessment by the administrative coordinator the night before. 3 opponents, 2 Kellyan senior cadets and 1 Vorthari cadet. Each one had been selected from the Academy's advanced cohort. Each one was physically superior to me across most measurable categories. The test was simple in concept and complicated in practice. I had to remain functional and non-submitted for as long as possible. No lethal contact, full contact otherwise. The test would end either when I submitted, when the panel called time, or when all 3 opponents were no longer able to continue. Nobody told me that last clause because they expected it to be relevant. I checked the tape on my left hand. I rolled my neck. I breathed. At that moment, the biosensors were showing exactly what you would expect. My heart rate had climbed during the walk to the arena, during the gear check, during the standing and waiting. It was at 96 beats per minute when the doors on the far side of the arena opened and the first opponent walked in. He was a Vorthari cadet. His name was on the display board near the booth, but I was not looking at the display board. I was looking at him. He was younger than Drethar, which meant he had not yet reached his full development, which meant he was moving at perhaps 70% of what his species could produce at peak. 70% of Vorthari was still considerably faster than anything I could match on reaction time. I had known this since day 1 of the assessment. I had been thinking about it for 5 days. The signal tone sounded. He moved. He was fast. He was exactly as fast as I had expected, which is to say very fast. Fast in the way that your nervous system understands as dangerous before your brain has finished processing the input. He came in from the left and the angle was good. Angled for my weaker side, which he had presumably read from whatever data the Academy had shared about my earlier assessments. He knew I was slow. He was going to use the speed advantage in the first exchange and try to establish a positional control that would restrict my movement for the rest of the bout. I did not try to match his speed. I took the first contact on my arm, absorbed the force, and used the momentum he had generated to redirect him slightly off his intended line. Not enough to throw him, just enough to change where his weight was going. He recovered in less than a second. Of course he did, and came back with the second strike, already beginning before the first one had fully resolved. My heart rate at 30 seconds, 97 beats per minute. We traded for a full minute. He was faster. I was not trying to be faster. I was trying to be consistent, to stay moving, to make his speed work less perfectly than he expected it to by being somewhere slightly different each time he arrived. Not fast enough to fully evade. Consistently close enough that the angle of his strikes was rarely exactly what he had intended. At 1 minute in, he had not landed a clean dominant contact. He had landed contact several times. I was feeling it in my ribs and in one place on my jaw, but not the kind of contact that ends about. My heart rate at 1 minute, 84 beats per minute. In the observation booth, Isolon straightened in her chair. She looked at the number on her screen. She looked at the arena floor. She looked at the number again. Then she leaned toward her monitor without looking away from the arena, and her hand found the recalibration control by feel, and she pressed it. The sensor ran its check. The check confirmed the reading, 84 beats per minute, down from 97, down, while the opponent was still active, and the contact was still happening, and the physical demand was, if anything, higher than 30 seconds ago. Drethar, at the station next to her, said nothing, but he stopped writing. The second cadet entered at the 90-second mark. That was the escalation protocol. The first opponent was still active, still very much in the bout, and now there were 2 of them, and the geometry of the room changed entirely in the way that adding a second threat always changes the geometry of a room. My field of positioning narrowed. The angles that had been open a moment before were now occupied. The Vorthari cadet read the change in my attention and used it to come in for a strike that landed clean on my shoulder. I felt my shoulder. I noted it. I filed it. My heart rate at 90 seconds, 79 beats per minute. I shifted my position to put a corner of the engagement space against my left side, which reduced the angles I had to account for. Not eliminated. You cannot eliminate threat in 2-on-1, does not permit it, but reduced. The Kellyan cadets moved differently from the Vorthari. They were not as pure speed as he was, but they were more adaptive, quicker to read and respond to positional changes, better at communicating with each other through very small signals that I was not always fast enough to intercept. I focused on staying between them, on not letting them split my attention fully, on keeping my movement small and my choices clear. In the observation booth, Vorkalis had put down his stylus. He was watching the arena floor with the expression of someone who is updating a model in real time and is not certain the new version is correct yet. My heart rate at 2 minutes, 71 beats per minute. Shenshada's fear chemistry sensors were producing a reading that the display labeled, with careful scientific neutrality, as anomalous. The fear markers were present. I was not without fear. My chemistry had not gone quiet the way it would have on a sedative or in a state of dissociation. The fear was there, but it was diminishing in a way that did not correspond to any reduction in threat. The threat was higher than when the session started. The fear was lower. The two lines on Shenada's display, which should have been moving in the same direction, were moving in opposite directions, and the gap between them was growing. Shenada looked at the display for a long moment. Then Shenada turned to look at the arena floor. The third cadet entered at 2 minutes 45 seconds. The room changed again. There is a quality to being outnumbered 3-1 that is different from being outnumbered 2-1 in ways that are not entirely about mathematics. It is about attention, about the way your focus has to become so distributed that it is almost not focus at all anymore, just a kind of wide and continuous awareness that takes in all available information without latching on to any single point of it. You cannot watch 3 things the way you watch one thing. You can only watch everything and hope that the part of you that has been doing this long enough knows what to do with what it sees. I had been doing this long enough. I moved to the center of the space. I stopped trying to manage geometry and started simply responding to what was immediate and clear. The Vorthari came from the right. I moved with him rather than against him. One of the Kellyan cadets came from behind and found I was not where I was when he committed to the direction. The other Kellyan was waiting to read my response to the first two. Everything slowed down. Not in the way that time actually slows down, which it does not. In the way that your mind, when it has stopped fighting the situation and started living in it, stops experiencing the gap between stimulus and response as something that has to be bridged, and starts experiencing it as space that is simply there, that has always been there, that can be inhabited rather than crossed. My father had described this once. He had not described it in the context of fighting. He had described it in the context of fixing a very complicated piece of machinery at 2 in the morning, when everything depended on getting it right, and how at a certain point the noise in his head had gone quiet and there had just been the work, very clear, one step at a time. He had said, something settles. Like everything that isn't useful just falls away, something settled. My heart rate at 3 minutes 61 beats per minute. In the observation booth, Laurel Dev had been still for the last 40 seconds. She was not watching the data screens. She was watching me. She was watching the way I moved, the way I positioned, the specific quality of the attention I was carrying. She had seen a great many things in 41 years of instruction, and before that in a career long enough to fill a classified file. She had seen courage and she had seen training, and she had seen the various combinations of determination and physical gift that made candidates worth keeping. She had not seen this particular thing before, or rather, she had seen traces of it in field reports, and in the occasional graduate whose performance in live operations exceeded what their academy record had predicted. She had seen the data from those graduates. She had wondered about the mechanism. She put her stylus down very quietly on the edge of her monitoring station. Drethar was running a calculation on his secondary screen. He had pulled up the physiological literature on human combat response. He was looking for the mechanism that explained what he was seeing. He found references to something called the acute stress response inversion, a documented but rare human phenomenon in which sustained and escalating threat could, in subjects with specific conditioning histories and neurological profiles, produce a parasympathetic rather than sympathetic nervous system shift beyond a certain intensity threshold. It had been studied. It had been measured. It had been considered a curiosity, a statistical outlier, a thing that happened in a small percentage of human combatants, and was noted in post-action reports, and then filed, and largely not followed up on. He was following it up now. The Vorthari cadet came in for a combination, and I caught 2 out of 3 of them, and the third one found my ribs again, on the same side as before, which meant that side was going to need attention after this. But it also meant that my positioning for the next sequence was already ahead of where it needed to be, because I had felt the angle of his approach, and my body had started adjusting before the conscious calculation had completed. This was the thing. This was what Laurel Dev was watching and what Drethar was reading about and what Shenada was recording with sensor arrays that had never been designed to measure quite this. The thing that 14 years of hard work and one particular inheritance from a very long human history had produced in me was not speed, not strength, not the clean statistical dominance of a Vorthari, or the adaptive intelligence of a Kellian, or the endurance of a Mekari. It was a quality of presence under maximum pressure that did not diminish as the pressure increased. It was the capacity to be completely and precisely in the moment, without needing the moment to be smaller than it was. Humans had built this over thousands of years of being the animal that did not have the best speed or the best strength or the best armor, and had compensated by developing, across long generations, a relationship to danger that no other species had needed to find, because no other species had survived for so long on the narrow edge between those deficits and the absolute necessity of continuing to exist anyway. At 3 minutes 40 seconds, one of the Kellian cadets submitted. Not because I had forced a dominant hold, because he had been absorbing contact and positional loss for 4 minutes, and his body had made the calculation his conscious mind had been resisting. His hand went down, the signal light went green, 2 left. My heart rate did not change, 61 beats per minute. Isolon stood up from her station. Not dramatically. She simply stood, because she could not sit still with the data she was looking at. The Vorthari cadet and the remaining Kellian cadet exchanged something between them. A look, a micro-signal, the kind of communication that happens between trained partners without words. They adjusted. They came in simultaneously from angles that were designed to prevent the kind of distributed attention I had been using. It was smart. It was the right tactical response to what they were observing. It did not work the way they hoped, because what they were observing was not a technique. Techniques can be countered. Techniques have an architecture that can be found and exploited. What they were observing was something closer to a state, a way of being in a room rather than a way of doing something in a room, and states do not have the same structural vulnerabilities as techniques. I took contact from both of them in the next 40 seconds. Real contact, the kind that registered clearly. My shoulder had been uncomfortable since the second cadet entered, and it was now expressing its unhappiness more loudly. My ribs were making a similar case. My jaw from the first exchange had quieted down to a background note that I was aware of but was not prioritizing. None of these were reasons to stop. None of these were the loudest thing in the room. At 5 minutes and 12 seconds, the Vorthari cadet's positioning broke down. Not dramatically, just slightly. He had been extremely fast and extremely good for 5 minutes, and the accumulation of small angles that had not resolved exactly as he had intended had added up to a moment where his weight was forward and slightly to the right, and the follow-through was not where he needed it to be. I was there. What followed lasted approximately 3 seconds, and resulted in him being in a position where he could not continue without taking real damage. He held for a moment, a long moment, the moment in which you are deciding whether what you want is worth what it will cost. And then his hand went down, 1 left, my heart rate, 61 beats per minute. The remaining Kaelian looked at me across the floor. He was good. He had been the most patient of the 3, the most adaptive, the one who had been watching and adjusting throughout. He came in now not with speed or force but with precision. Tight, careful, measuring every exchange before committing to it. We went for another 2 minutes in what felt almost more like a conversation than a fight. He would propose something. I would answer. Neither of us was finding clean resolution. Then he found one. He found a clean angle, and he committed to it fully. And the result was that I was briefly in a position where the cleanest option was not a technique, but simply an acceptance. I took the contact, full, without trying to redirect it. Because absorbing it cleanly kept me upright, and absorbing it cleverly would have taken me down. I absorbed it. I stayed upright. He looked at me. I looked at him. I moved. Another 40 seconds. Another exchange. And then his rhythm broke the way the Vorthari cadet's rhythm had broken. Not because he was failing, but because he was human in the sense that all beings are a little human. which is to say that sustained ambiguity eventually cost something, and what it had cost him was a half-second of hesitation. And in the half-second of hesitation I found what I needed. His hand went down at 7 minutes and 4 seconds. The signal tone sounded, my heart rate 61 beats per minute. I stood in the center of the arena and breathed. The silence in the observation booth lasted approximately 4 seconds. I counted them without looking up, because I was still standing in the arena, and there were 3 cadets in various states of recovery around me, and I was still in the room, still present, still in the state, and it takes a moment for the state to release you, rather than the other way around. Then Laurel Dev's voice came through the arena speaker system. Low, clear, without ceremony. Assessment concluded. I looked at my hands. The tape on my left hand had come loose during the bout. The knuckles underneath were marked in the way knuckles get marked. I pressed the tape back down, which was useless but felt like the right thing to do. I looked up at the observation booth. 5 silhouettes behind the glass. 5 sets of eyes looking down at me. 5 monitoring stations showing 61 beats per minute on a human being who had just spent 7 minutes in a room with 3 opponents who, should by every model the Academy had ever built, have been capable of ending the bout far earlier. I gave them a small nod. Then I walked off the arena floor to get my shoulder looked at. The medical bay was quiet. The attending medic, a Thaishan whose name I had not caught, worked on my shoulder with the calm efficiency of someone who had treated a great many different bodies and regarded them all as interesting structural problems. My ribs got wrapped. My jaw got scanned and cleared of anything serious. I was given something for the inflammation and told to rest the shoulder for at least 2 days, which I filed under things I intended to do if the situation permitted. I was sitting on the edge of the treatment table, waiting for the medic to finish her notes, when the first knock came. It was Drethar. He stood in the doorway with his 6 arms arranged in the precise way I had come to understand was his version of standing at ease. He looked at the harness still on my wrist, at the readings still broadcasting from it. He looked at my shoulder. Then he said, I would like to know whether what I observed is trainable. I told him it was. That the baseline had to be there. Not everyone had it in the same degree. But that training could build the pathway, deepen it, make it more reliable. I told him it was mostly about learning not to fight the state when it tried to arrive. Most training, I said, accidentally teaches people to manage fear upward, to push against it, to stay active and loud inside the experience of danger. What produced the inversion was almost the opposite. It was learning to stop managing and start inhabiting. He was quiet for a moment. We have no curriculum for this, he said. I told him I knew. He nodded once the way he always nodded, precise, brief, carrying more weight than it appeared to. Then he left. Isolon arrived a few minutes later. She sat in the chair near the treatment table and opened her datapad without preamble. I need to revise a paper, she said. I told her she had 11 years of research, and she was probably better placed than I was to say what needed revising. She looked at me over the top of the pad. The paper argues that human stress response profiles, while unusual in their variability, fall within the predictive framework we use for all alliance species. She paused. The data from your assessment does not support that argument. I asked what the data supported instead. She thought about it with the careful precision she brought to everything. The data supports the argument, she said slowly, that humans have developed a stress response pathway that the framework was not built to measure, because no other species that has contributed to the framework possesses it. I told her that sounded right to me. She made a note. Then she closed the pad and looked at me for a moment with those very attentive eyes. When I study a subject, she said, I try to understand it fully before I form conclusions. I have been studying humans for 11 years. She paused. I had formed a conclusion. I waited. I was wrong, she said simply. I told her that finding out you are wrong about something is usually more valuable than finding out you were right. She considered this. Then she made another note. I suspected about the comment itself, and left. Vorkalis came next. He did not sit. He stood near the door in the way that Mechari stand when they are in spaces calibrated for smaller beings, which is with a careful consciousness of their dimensions. He looked at my wrapped ribs and my shoulder and the tape on my knuckles. Then he bowed. Not deeply. The Mechari version of a bow is small and very precise, but it was unmistakable. I recognized it because I had read about it in the Xenoculture briefing on the transport, and I had filed it under things that were theoretically possible, but that I had not genuinely expected to experience. I bowed back as correctly as I could manage given my shoulder. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said in his careful translated voice, in 40 years of instruction, I have not previously needed to update my assessment of a candidate's physical capability upward after their performance metrics indicated otherwise. I told him I appreciated that. He nodded. Small, precise, and left. Shenata arrived quietly. The way Shenata did everything. Those large, pale eyes in the medical bay light. The translation interface at the collar. There was a long silence, which I had come to understand was Shenata's way of being present before speaking. The fear was real, Shenata said finally. Your chemistry confirmed it throughout. I told him yes, it was real throughout. I had not stopped being afraid. Another silence. Then what changed? Shenata asked. I thought about how to say it. I had been thinking about how to say it for most of my adult life in various contexts, to various people who had seen the same thing and asked the same question. The fear stopped being the loudest voice, I said. It was still there. It was saying what it always says. But at a certain point something else was saying something louder, and I listened to that instead. Shenata was very still. What was the other voice saying? The translation interface asked. I thought about it honestly. It was saying, you know what to do, and it was right. Shenata sat with that for a moment. Then, among my people, the fear voice and the action voice are separate. The hive mediates between them. Individual Queth rarely experience them simultaneously. Another pause. You carried both at once. I said I supposed that was true, that it was not always comfortable, but it was useful. Shenata made a note, looked at me one more time. Left without further comment, which I had come to understand was the Queth equivalent of a great deal. The last to arrive was Laurel Dev. She came in unhurried, with the measured pace of someone who has been walking into rooms for a very long time and has stopped being in a hurry about any of them. She sat in the chair near the treatment table. She looked at me the way she had looked at me at the end of our strategic session, directly, steadily, with the quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades finding out what things actually are, rather than what they appear to be. She did not open a data pad. She did not bring notes. She came with nothing but the question she had already asked me twice. Do you know what you are? She said. This time I did not hesitate. We are the species, I said, that got good at not dying by deciding, somewhere along the way, that the fear was less important than the thing we were afraid of losing. She looked at me for a long time. Which is? She asked. I thought about Colonel Bright saying, come back. I thought about the corridor with no human names on the plaques. I thought about my father's 2 fingers on my wrist, and a voice saying your body knows something your head hasn't caught up to yet. I thought about 14 years of service and one strange assignment, and the deep and permanent dark outside the window of my quarters, and the stars I could not name, burning the same way they had always burned, indifferent and permanent and very far from home. Each other, I said. Mostly. Laurel Dev was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the evaluation file on her data pad, and she made a single notation at the bottom, and she turned it so I could see the screen. The notation said, accepted. She closed the pad and stood. The Academy has needed this for some time, she said. We simply did not have a name for it. I told her we called it many things, that none of the names were quite right, that maybe that was fine, because the thing did not need a name to work. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Then she nodded, once, in the Thaishan way. That means I have heard what you said and it will stay with me, and she walked out. I sat alone in the medical bay. My shoulder ached. My ribs were a low and consistent argument. My jaw had rejoined the background chorus. My hands felt the tape and the marks underneath, and the specific tiredness that comes after something that asked for everything. I checked my pulse. 2 fingers on my wrist, the way my father had taught me when I was a child and the world felt large. 64 beats per minute. Back to resting. Back to normal. Back to the ordinary and unremarkable rhythm of a human being at rest in a quiet room, heart doing what hearts do. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise any flags on any biosensor screen. Nothing that would make a Kaelian researcher stand up from her station or a Vorthari. Instructor put down his stylus. Just a pulse. I looked out the small window of the medical bay at the stars. The configuration was still unfamiliar. I was still the only human on a station of 4,000 beings. There were still no human names on the plaques in the corridor. Not yet. I found that funny. I did not entirely know why. I just sat there with my aching shoulder and my wrapped ribs and the perfectly ordinary 64 beats of a heart that had been measured very carefully today and had, in its quiet and unremarkable way, said everything it needed to say. I was going to be a very long way from home for a while. I was looking forward to it.